to Bible class here at the park. Glad you're here today. We are here today in chapter 9 of the story. If you're unfamiliar with what the story is, if you're just joining us, catching up to us here in chapter 9, the story is this book put together by Max Lucado and Randy Frazee that's meant to tell the story of the Bible in narrative form. It's the story of the Bible in its own words. And certainly we find lots of value in the poetry and the prophecy and the other literary styles of the Bible. But this takes the narrative that we find laid out and played out in Scripture and puts it together in such a way that helps us to really grasp the story, which is why it's called the story. And so today we're in chapter 9, which is titled The Faith of a Foreign Woman. We have here today, we gain an understanding around the book of Ruth as we see it in our Old Testaments. It's important as we start to understand kind of where we are chronologically in the story of Israel and where Ruth lands in all of that. So Israel began through Abraham, grew in Egypt, was led out of Egypt into the desert by Moses, found their way, led by God, into the promised land, actually delivered into the promised land by Joshua. They took over and occupied the promised land, at least part of it. And now they're living in the promised land. They're occupying the place that God provided for them, but still lots of enemies around them. So they are a nation with the presence of mind to know that there are enemies around them. And so the book of Ruth finds them in this season of living surrounded by enemies. They're living in a place where to the extent that they follow God, they enjoy a time of peace. And when they forget God, then they find themselves in times of war. So God raises up for them judges, and as we saw last week, judges we're not meant to think of a courtroom and a gavel when we think of a judge, but more like a leader of a warrior leader of a tribe on the front lines, raised up for just this moment. Leaders of Israel's army and are able to, as the judges follow God, so Israel succeeds. And as the judges forget God and follow their own way and create their own gods and worship other gods, and Israel follows suit, they find themselves defeated and taken captive by these neighboring nations. So the book of Ruth, in the chronology of the Old Testament, we see the first sentence of the book of Ruth says, "In the days when the judges ruled." So Ruth is kind of put inside the book of Judges as far as the chronology of it goes. The timeline of the Old Testament, Ruth is kind of inside, set somewhere in the days of the judges. And so what we need to look at is what is happening in the book of Judges, and what, man, the Judges, isn't it, if you remember from last week, if you're following along and if you read through the book of Judges, it's a dark time. These judges were used by God, but not because they were holy, morally upright people who followed God with everything they did. These were not all that, not super faithful, not always these savory characters, some kind of unsavory things in their lives, but God continues to remain faithful to His promise and uses whoever's necessary, whoever's available to maintain His promise. The whole point of this, God is fulfilling His promise. So that's what we're trying to follow along, is we're following God's promise through all this. There's not just a big slew of role models in the book of Judges. You know, there's people who displayed great faith at different times, and we can recognize that and honor that. But God used these imperfect people to fulfill His promise. But kind of a dark time in the history of the nation of Israel. The book of Judges is. The last sentence, let me point you to the last sentence of the book of Judges. It says, "In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit." That doesn't provide for a great, healthy culture, is with everyone doing as they saw fit. They had no king. So the book of Judges ends with us looking forward. What is our hope here? From where is there going to come someone who can lead us into safety, into peace, into hope, into enjoying being God's people? Who is going to be the leader that's going to get us there? And so that's how the book of Judges ends, looking forward to, is there any hope in the future? Israel had no king. What's going to happen? The book of Ruth starts like this. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So what I'm looking for here, based off how we just ended Judges, what I'm looking for is, surely there's a character going to be introduced in the story soon who's going to be the Redeemer, who's going to help bring us out of this terrible place and lead Israel the way Israel needs to be led. So when I see in this first verse of the book of Ruth, it says, "So a man from Bethlehem in Judah," now it goes on, "together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab." Okay, there's a famine in Israel, so they leave and go live in, they're enjoying a time of peace with Moab, but it's formerly an enemy territory, but they go live in Moab because there's food there. So there's a famine in the land, so they leave. But I don't think we need to overlook, as we're looking for who is going to be the one to redeem Israel, we get introduced to, and the way he gets introduced here, I don't think is just happenstance. I think it's on purpose. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah. So I'm thinking, as we look forward, maybe there's a man from Bethlehem in Judah who's going to be the one to redeem all this. And so we continue on. This man from Bethlehem in Judah was Elimelech and his wife Naomi and their 2 sons. And the book of Ruth, the storyline is a little bit tricky to follow. Let me try to help us understand this. Elimelech and Naomi, with their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, they moved to Moab. Mahlon and Chilion married Moabite women. So now there's a husband and wife, Elimelech and Naomi, 2 sons and their 2 wives. The 3 men of the family, Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion, all die in Moab. So now we're left with just Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law. Her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. So by the title of the book, we see that Ruth is one we need to be paying attention to. Naomi finds out the famine in Israel is over. So she has no reason to stay in Moab anymore. She's going to go back to Israel and all but begs Orpah and Ruth, stay in Moab. Please don't come with me. Stay in Moab. You'll be much better off. You'll be able to find another husband and remarry and build a family. It'll be great for you here. And if you come with me to Israel, you're probably not going to get treated all that well. It's so much better for you to stay in Moab. Orpah tearfully agrees and says, I will stay. Ruth showed kindness to her, showed a real sense of loyalty to her mother-in-law by saying, I will not go. I will go with you. I will stay with you. your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Such an expression of faithfulness and loyalty that she shows to Ruth here, or that Ruth shows to Naomi here. So Ruth goes back with Naomi and kind of takes over, helping take care of Naomi in her older age. And Naomi does not have anyone else to help take care of her. So Ruth steps in and helps provide for her, and sets out and agrees with Naomi, I'm going to go glean in a nearby field. So in this agrarian culture that we find ourselves in, these big fields of wheat are gathered by the owner of the field, but it's not 100% efficient way of doing that. So there's wheat often left behind, and people will come behind and kind of get what they can take from what's been left behind. It's called gleaning in the field. And so Ruth sets out with Naomi's blessing and permission to go glean in a nearby field. Well, she happened into a field owned by a man named Boaz. So she runs into Boaz, and Boaz learns that she is the daughter-in-law of Ruth, and they come to realize that Boaz is from the tribe of Elimelech. So he's in the family, not blood related to Ruth, which is good for us to know, but is in the family of Naomi. And he plays an important role in this family. And this is a phrase that's helpful to understand, and I'm growing in my understanding of this phrase. We find out that Boaz is a kinsman redeemer in this family. Now, a kinsman redeemer, I think, try to describe it the best I can. It's someone who holds a role in the family, who he oversees the protection, provision, and continued legacy of everyone within the family, of everyone within the tribe. And to the extent that someone is unable to fulfill any family duty that could ensure their protection, their provision, and their legacy, the kinsman redeemer steps in and redeems them or their land or their legacy. So this is someone who oversees the protection, provision, and continued legacy of a family. So Ruth goes back to Naomi and says, "You'll never believe whose field I was in today. I came to the field of Boaz, who is a kinsman redeemer in this family." Naomi gets fired up. She says to Ruth, "Get your makeup on, put your nice clothes on. You're going back to Boaz." And so she goes back to Boaz, and there's some other cultural language that is a little bit helpful for us to understand, not to get totally confused. She basically, in the culturally appropriate way, presents herself to Boaz in a way that lets him know that she is making herself available in marriage to him, that she will put herself under his authority as husband, that she will offer herself to him as husband. Now, I think there's some phrasing here that we can think, oh, does that mean something weird? I think it's all done culturally appropriate. I don't think there's anything sketchy about the way she approaches him, but there's some language that we don't in our current culture understand. So I think this is all done appropriately, and she goes and presents herself to Boaz, making herself available to him, and Boaz agrees to marry her. And there's more to the story, but to cut to the chase a little bit, to stick with the story, we end up with Boaz marries Ruth, and the way Scripture defines it and describes it, the Lord allowed Ruth to become pregnant, which helps us to understand that maybe she couldn't have a child before this time, which totally falls in line with all the other generations of Israel, of God moving his story along. God provides in such a way to Israel and to Israel's continued provision, protection, and legacy that they understand this must be God continuing to fulfill his promise. It cannot be by our own power. And we see that through lots of generations of barrenness, of different reasons of being unable to have a child, and God provides. God opens the womb. God allows them to become pregnant and have a child. So that's the idea we get with Boaz and Ruth. Ruth is able to have a child, and they have a child. And Ruth, in essence, hands this child over to Naomi to care for this child. So now, this is now Naomi's child to raise and to take care of. And this child now becomes the legacy, so now the kinsman redeemer of the family has come in and provided in such a way that allows for the continued protection, provision, and legacy of this family, and gives up his only child to continue to carry on this protection, provision, and legacy. The kinsman redeemer has saved this legacy. And we'll see how important that is in just a minute. So Boaz and Ruth have a child and name him Obed. Obed, we see, now we can look at, I think the most important parts of the book of Ruth are the first couple sentences and last couple sentences. And we see how God works behind the scenes. And we'll talk about that in a second. God working behind the scenes to carry on and accomplish his will, to fulfill his promise. The last 5 verses of the book of Ruth is a genealogy. And we see that the son of Boaz and Ruth was named Obed. Obed was a father of Jesse. And Jesse is a father of, you know it, you guessed it, David. And so this legacy that was protected by the kinsman redeemer continues on to King David. And spoiler alert here in the story, King David, a number of generations later, we find born in this lineage, our kinsman redeemer in the person of Jesus Christ. So what we have here, in this dark time of Israel, in the time of the judges, we see this little story being played out, which one interesting note about the book of Ruth is how little God is mentioned. Now, they mention God. They're believers. They're in the nation of Israel, and so God is their God. Yahweh is their God. But the writer of the book of Ruth does not take time to explain what God is doing. There's these moments of, it just so happened to be. It just so happened to be that she found herself in the field of Boaz while Boaz was out. It just so happened to be that Boaz was the kinsman redeemer of the family of Elimelech, and so is able to provide in a complete way for Naomi and her family. It just so happened to be that Boaz is also the daughter of Rahab. Rahab, we know as the woman who took in the spies of Israel, who as a foreign woman provided safety for the men of God as they were spying out the promised land. And so, man, we see this continued tradition of an understanding of what it means to be an outsider and be shown protection and provision and guidance and safety from an outsider, from someone from another nation. And so we see that continued character tradition being played out with Boaz, who recognizes, who has a history of his family recognizing the value of taking care of someone from another nation. So a lot of beautiful things happening in the book of Ruth. I want to understand just a couple things happening in the upper story. Let's continue to remember the upper story, this the framework of the upper and lower story that Lucado and Fritzy present in the story. Is the upper story is God, what God is doing to continue on his promises for the nation of Israel and for all of creation being redeemed back to him, and the lower story being the details of what happens in our life. Ruth is written totally from a perspective of lower story, but we get these little hints of what God's doing in the upper story, continuing on his promise. That's kind of the first couple sentences in the last few verses of the book of Ruth really help us to see what God is doing, and all these things along the way that help us to understand what's happening. So in the upper story, in the book of Ruth, we have hope for the nation of Israel that a Redeemer is still coming. In this dark time of the book of Judges, it's easy to lose hope. And doesn't Naomi represent a lot of us in the way that she loses hope? She is ready when her two sons and her husband dies. She's ready just to go back to Israel and just live out her days as a widow and kind of give up hope of ever having any real value in culture or anything of any value or redemption happening in her life. Do we get into times when all we can see is the darkness around us? Now, it's the time of Judges, which is a dark time for Israel, and this is an incredibly dark time even personally in the life of Naomi. Do we find ourselves in moments where we lose hope because of the darkness around us? One of the upper story things that we can see in this is God continues to provide hope for those in the middle of darkness. God provides a grandson to restore her hope. The hope for the redemption of not only us as individuals, but as us as a people of God, no matter how dark the times look. And man, we're in a season. I've never believed this about my life until these past couple of years, and even current events as we sit here in early March 2022. I've never believed that I've lived in a time of history that's going to be remembered forever and for hundreds of years down the road, that this is a time that people will look back and note in history this time and what has happened in the world, in our country. We are living through times that will be remembered. And this is a time that people are going to look back on and think, wow, that must have been a difficult time to live through. And so in these times that can be looked at as, yeah, there's pretty dark times. Global pandemic, war, social, political unrest, almost everywhere you look. Where can we find our hope? Well, we find our hope in the details of life as God is working as our kinsman redeemer, redeeming situations all around us if we'll just open our eyes to look. We talked about the word providence a minute ago. Here's a good working definition for you for the word providence. Providence is God working behind the scenes to accomplish his will. God working behind the scenes in human history to accomplish his will. And in the time of Judges, in this dark time, what could God possibly be doing in the background to bring hope to the situation? Well, that's what the book of Ruth is all about, helping us to see and to continue to understand God has not left or forgotten about his promises or his people. He is continuing to be faithful to us even though we are an absolute mess of roller coaster of a people and a history, God continues to be steady and faithful to his promises to his people. So our takeaway today from the book of Ruth is, however dark the big picture is, God is in the details. We hear this story, this phrase that you'll hear pop up just in culture, the devil's in the details, which we use that phrase to mean, yeah, it's great to have these big picture ideas, but the really nitty gritty parts of how this gets worked out, and maybe the really difficult part is really in how the details get worked out. Well, I think maybe that phrase needs some redemption, because as we see, God provides hope because God is in the details. God is in the details of the mundane, small stories of our life. God is using those to bring his grand picture of redemption to all of creation. Don't ever think that a situation is too small or that you are not noticeable enough to God for him to use you and your circumstance for a great story of redemption. God may use you and your redemption story to help one other person. God might also use you and your redemption story to carry on the protection, provision, and legacy of his people for generations to come. We never know how God is in the details, working behind the scenes in human history to accomplish his will. However dark the big picture is, God is in the details. That's what the book of Ruth is all about. If you have any questions, anything you'd like to talk to me about, any prayer requests you'd like to let us know about, how can we be a blessing to you? You can go to our website, theparkchurchtulsa.org, and follow the Connect card and let us know if you want to just continue a conversation with me or anybody else, or let us know how we can pray or be a blessing to you and your family. We'd love to do that for you. Blessings on your Sunday or whenever you're watching this. Have a great day. See you guys soon.